Juniors, this afternoon we're going to talk about, continue talking about our civil rights movement. Today we're going to focus on what the civil rights movement looked like for Hispanic Americans and Native Americans. So starting with Hispanic Americans and kind of getting an understanding of that, the main leader for or one of the key people, I guess you would view for the Hispanics civil rights movement was Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez, what he tried to do, what he aimed to do was to get better representation for Hispanic Americans who were working on farms. Historically speaking, especially 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of these Hispanic Americans who would come from either Mexico or parts of Central America, when they would come to the United States, oftentimes they would seek work on farms in, somewhere in the southwestern United States, usually in Southern California. And what Chavez aimed to do was to gain better representation for them as a workers union, as a labor union, and that was kind of one of his big goals. So he's viewed as kind of an equivalent as Martin Luther King for the African American civil rights movement. Chavez is viewed as kind of an equivalent for the Hispanic Americans civil rights movement. As far as some issues that were kind of needing to be addressed, or that Hispanic Americans were wanting addressed during the civil rights movement here in the, again, kind of the same time period following World War II and into the 1970s and 80s, Hispanic Americans faced a variety of different forms of discrimination in the United States. And one of those examples was the barrios. And these were traditionally Spanish-speaking neighborhoods that were kind of segregated from the rest of, say like the white culture or the white population, not by law, but just based on the settlement of people. And these barrios were oftentimes kind of, run down in that regard. And it was something where, local governments would sometimes, build something new in the barrios. It would drive up land prices, and pretty soon the Hispanic community would have to find somewhere else to live, because oftentimes they were impoverished and they could not afford the new rent or however. And again, we usually think about Hispanic Americans. A person would probably, would think of somebody from Mexico, but understand that, throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, we saw a growing population of Puerto Ricans, especially after the United States had made Puerto Rico a U.S. territory. We saw a rise in Cuban immigration following the rise of the Castro regime in Cuba. And then from Central American countries such as Guatemala, we also saw an increase in Guatemalan population in the United States because of some of the civil wars and different things that were happening in Central America. And that is the reason why, or one of the reasons why, this particular group of people aim to, settle in the United States. As we had discussed previously, a lot of the Hispanic Americans who came over to the United States during this time, a lot of them ended up working on farms. And again, some of the work of Chavez was attempting to organize the farm labor, right? So eventually what does happen is a labor union is created for the Hispanic farm workers called the United Farm Workers Organizing Union. And, through, labor union methods, strikes, boycotts, etc., eventually this labor union was able to acquire a higher wage for some of the farm hands, generally Hispanic Americans who were helping out on the farm. So that was something that was an important gain for this demographic during the civil rights movement. Other things that were kind of issues that they tried to address during the civil rights movement was also education opportunities. Oftentimes, public schools in the United States would only teach in English, or they would only offer language services in English. Some of the different civil rights groups called for bilingual opportunities, or for opportunities for students to be taught in Spanish with the opportunity to learn English kind of as they went, to not disenfranchise them, so that they had the same opportunity to learn as all other students. And eventually in 1968, Congress actually passed a law that required schools to provide some of those bilingual services. Also talking about politics, the law Risa Unida. This was a political group that aimed to get more Mexican or Hispanic representation, particularly in the state of Texas. And it was something where they sometimes used different tactics that might be considered militant to gain attention for their following. But again, it was something where they were trying to bring attention to the fact that Hispanic Americans were underrepresented, in government via Congress or however. Talking more about Native Americans here, again, historically, we talk about the United States and the relationships with Native Americans. It has traditionally not been a very smooth relationship. It goes all the way back to European colonization. But kind of, again, this is all going along on the same period, juniors. That's important to remember that African Americans are fighting for civil rights at the same time as Hispanic Americans and Native Americans and females and the LGBTQ community. So understand that it's one group of people going on at a different one period of time. It's all these groups kind of around the same time are fighting for civil rights, for the extension of rights that they did not have. And so Native Americans historically in the United States had not been treated very well. You go back to how the reservation system was founded and some of the early treaties the United States government had made with Native American tribes. And the history there is very rocky. And one of the things that Native Americans were trying to bring attention to during the civil rights movement was their lack of autonomy, basically meaning that they didn't have a lot of power, like as a reservation or on a reservation, to make decisions for themselves. Oftentimes it was the U.S. government still making decisions for the reservation, which is not the way the reservation system was designed. And there was mass amounts of poverty too associated with the Native American demographics, especially on the reservations. So those are things that they were aiming to address. Eventually, through a variety of marches and that kind of thing. A group of Native Americans in 1961, they met in Chicago and they penned what they called the Declaration of Indian Purpose. And that was supposed to be kind of a rallying call for Native Americans to gain more autonomy so that they could ultimately, have more say-so in the direction of their tribe and such, and have some of that autonomy that was supposed to be a part of the reservation system. Later on in the late 60s, President Johnson will create the National Council on Indian Opportunity. And again, that was something that was supposed to allow for more autonomy of Native Americans. Also talk about the Indian or American Indian movement, also known as AIM. AIM, again, was kind of another more militant civil rights group where there was oftentimes squabbles between them and law enforcement and such based on tactics. And again, they were maybe a little bit more aggressive in some of the things that they were demanding or how they were asking for it. But some of the things that they were, trying to fight for were against police brutality against Native Americans. They were trying to acquire old Native American lands, including like their sacred burial grounds and hunting grounds and things of that nature. And AIM eventually in the early 70s will actually march on Washington, D.C. and, demand that, to receive some land back. And as a part of this march, they actually caused some damage, to the Capitol grounds. So, and they were totally against the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Bureau of Indian Affairs had been created previously to do some of these things that the groups were asking for, but Native Americans oftentimes did not think very highly of the Bureau of Indian Affairs because to them it was something that was created by white Americans to continue to take advantage of Native Americans. Oftentimes that's kind of how it was viewed. Other things, talk about voting rights. There were some states here, even after the 15th Amendment, that would deny Native Americans voting rights. So what we see is through a variety of laws passed, a variety of new laws that get passed eventually, and civil rights acts. The 1965 Voting Rights Act is an important one. We start to see where the federal government starts taking some of the control away from the states to limit who can vote. Because again, oftentimes when we think of voting rights, you think of African Americans and kind of the lack of voting rights oftentimes they experience. Native Americans experience very similar things. So like the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that we've talked about previously, that was something else that also aided Native Americans in extending voting rights to them, not allowing states to disenfranchise them of their voting right based on their heritage. And then the other thing, especially getting into the 70s and 80s, is Native Americans will make a variety of agreements with the federal government. The federal government will actually return some land and cash to the Native Americans that based on old treaties that had been violated by the United States. So those were some of the items here associated with the Native American civil rights movement. Again, things that historically you're thinking, based on the way Native Americans in the United States have kind of interacted over the past 200 or so years, things that would make sense and gains that they were trying to make. Obviously, I would understand there's, especially in my opinion, there's still a lot of work here that needs to be done between the United States government and Native American tribes. And hopefully we continue to see more growth there.